I want to acknowledge all senior elders that are with us. They play an important part in the transition of knowledge, our journey, but more importantly, the way in which we take ourselves into the future. I want to acknowledge Frank Archibald. It's tremendous when you have a memorial lecture honouring someone whose contribution has been significant. But to all of his family members who I've met today, it's been a privilege, and I thank you for that. In my own language, I say Kaya Wanju, hello and welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and where we meet tonight, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and importantly, tonight's emerging leaders and future leaders. I also want to just reflect on the drought that you're experiencing here, the dryness of the country as I flew in, but more importantly, the people who are fighting the fires. I just want to acknowledge their contribution to protecting us. At the beginning of the dreaming, the earth was flat, dry and empty. There were no trees, no rivers, no animals, no grass. It was a dry and flat land. One day, Gorilla, or in Nyungar, Wago, the Rainbow Serpent, awoke from his sleep and set off to find his tribe. He crossed Australia from east to west and north to south, stopping to listen for his people. He crossed every part of the flat, dry Australia, but found nothing. The land he lay down to sleep on was not the same land he had set out to search for his people. His big, long body had cut great gouges in the land. He laid in the sand all alone until he decided to create more life in the world. This is the beginning of one of our most significant dreaming stories, the Rainbow Serpent. It tells of the creation of this great land from a blank canvas to a rich tapestry of life, imagination and wonder. For Indigenous Australians, the dreaming and our stories are the start of our educational pathway. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have used stories, art, song and dance to pass on the stories of creation, culture and the ways of our people down through generations for tens of thousands of years. They are central as to how we shape and understand our culture, our place and our nations. All people, when starting their educational journey, embark on a path of unknown potential. It is the decision we make, the knowledge we acquire and accumulate, learning knowledge that we pass on to future generations. It is in the things we teach and the things we seek to understand that ultimately define where this path will lead and the opportunities we will find on the way. If it weren't for my education and the opportunities that came from people investing in me, I wouldn't be standing here before you today. Some of you here tonight may have heard the story before, but it bears repeating because it demonstrates the immense power an individual can hold on empowering a child and setting them on a path that sustains them for a lifetime. Miss Abernethy, my Year 1 teacher, realised that I was behind the other kids in my class because I'd grown up in an isolated town that had no school and I did my schooling through correspondence and School of the Air. She suggested to me to come to school every morning at 8 o'clock before school started to meet her in the classroom. She used to have a wall, and I still see this as an image, a blackboard that had bricks that she had drawn and a picture of Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall. On that wall, Miss Abernethy would write a new word that I would have to learn each day. First, she'd get me to tell her what I thought the word was, and I'd have to sound it out and guess the meaning. If I was wrong, she would explain it to me. Then she would have me put it into a sentence. And after that, she would take me back through the other words on the wall that we'd already learned in the previous days and weeks. We did this day after day, and our wall of words grew substantially, although I always remained shy. Miss Abernethy was my teacher for 2 years. But she was really my teacher for a lifetime. She believed in me, supported me, and never gave up on me. That is the value of education. How can we use educational success to redefine Indigenous success? Recently, I've spoke about the need to reshape the way we approach Indigenous policy making, and this is particularly true when it comes to education. For too long, we have been treating the symptoms rather than addressing the cause. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to visit Yarrabah, an Indigenous community east of Cairns, and during my visit, I joined the remote school attendance strategy school run, and we drove from the local Yarrabah State School up and down the town, picking children up for school on the way. We put up at one house where a family of children were playing in the front yard. When one of these children realised it was time for school, he dropped to the ground. He refused to move and acted as a total dead weight for anybody who tried to pick him up, and had to be carried to the car by his family members. But his opposition prevailed and he was not getting on the bus. As educators and politicians and as teachers, we need to unpack why this is the reaction to going to school. Missing school 1 day per week every year results in 3 missed years of schooling by year 12. Programs such as the Remote School Attendance Strategy School Run are operating to reverse trends that have impacted on Indigenous Australians for far too long. If we don't work to identify the cause, we will never reverse the symptoms. I'm committed to getting more children to school no matter where they live. And over the few weeks from Yarrabah in Queensland to Groote Eylandt in the Northern Territory, I've been seeing innovative programs that are working with Indigenous children and families to increase school attendance and participation in education. I want us to be looking at what is working, what is already making a difference right across this country. What can we learn from those working in community to close the gap when it comes to education? And take these programs, often designed at the local level, to continue improving school attendance. I want us all to focus on the positive and what's working as opposed to the negative statistics, the gap. Imagine being a young Indigenous Australian and having your future regularly defined through disadvantage, disparity and underachievement. It's no wonder we create a sense of futility and create a mindset that we might never close the gap in educational attainment. I experienced this personally when I had a teacher say to me, "You know, you'd be better off leaving school and working on a farm. At least you would have a job for life. You know your people don't do well in education." That was the catalyst for me to defy low expectations and never allow their perception to alter my pathway in life. I wasn't accepting a stereotypified expectation of not being equal to my peers in that classroom. And we need to make sure that we don't diminish the dreams through the environment and narrative that we are setting for young Australians, particularly our children. We need to make sure that everything we do supports aspiration. Aspiration in education, aspiration in employment, and aspiration for community. So let's set the scene for a young Indigenous Australian embarking on their education journey. What excites me is that more Indigenous Australians are now attaining a Year 12 or an equivalent qualification. More Indigenous Australian students are staying in school longer, increasing their chances of successfully completing Year 12. More Indigenous Australians are studying higher level vocational education and training courses. More Indigenous Australians are going to university. And there is virtually no gap in employment outcomes between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and other Australians who hold a bachelor's degree. The retention rate from Year 7 and 8 to Year 12 increased from 48.7% in 2011 to 60.9% in 2018. Under the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy, or NAPLAN, the share of Indigenous students at or above minimum standards in Years 3 and 5 reading and Years 5 and 9 numeracy increased by around 10 percentage points between 2008 and 2018. This is educational success. This is Indigenous success. And this, despite Indigenous Australians being overrepresented in regional and remote areas, where the barriers to accessing education and training are the highest. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in remote areas can experience multiple layers of complex, compounding disadvantage, which affects the quality of their school education. As I did when I grew up as a child in Nanine, many Indigenous Australian students must relocate to attend secondary school. They often face cultural barriers, experience homesickness, and have limited access to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers and support networks. The remote school attendance strategy supports 13,300 Indigenous Australian students attending 84 schools in remote and very remote Australia. Excuse me. Remote school attendance strategy employs around 430 people. 410 are local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who work with families, students, communities and schools to encourage school attendance. In 2019, a new remote school attendance strategy model commenced that mandates communities planning local governance, flexible attendance activities and employment and training for local staff. The RAS operates in the Northern Territory in 40 schools, Queensland 14 schools, South Australia 14 schools, Western Australia 12 schools and New South Wales 4 schools. Indigenous student attendance worsens with remoteness. 63.4% in very remote areas compared to 85.8% in inter-regional areas in 2018. Now we need to build on the successes. We need to celebrate those successes and use success to redefine how Australia views the education of Indigenous people, because this represents some of the earliest footprints in a student's journey. And further down the path, we're seeing improvements in tertiary education. The number of Indigenous students enrolling for university has increased by 45% since 2013 to almost 20,000 students. Indigenous students are 31% less likely to attend university than the rest of the population, but this trend is improving. One of the interesting elements of the figures now is that when I was teaching and in charge of Aboriginal education, we'd see an apparent retention rate of, say, 14,000 Aboriginal children starting in year 1. But by the time they got to year 12, there'd be less than 1,000. And the question you have to ask is, where are the young ones that fall out of the system? And how are we re-engaging? And that's an important element in the thinking that we have to consider. But when I look back then to now, it is like chalk and cheese. It is really a quantum shift. But we've got more work to do, because education is the engine for change. It empowers individuals to make informed choices about what they want in life. Fiona Stanley did a research project with 4,000 Aboriginal families in Western Australia. The frightening figures that came out of that was that every student who left before year 10 had the worst indicators of disadvantage across the whole spectrum. Young girls tended to be pregnant early, tended not to look after the health of themselves or their child. Those who exited after year 10 made more discerning choices about the quality of life, both males and females. But those who finished and graduated from year 12 went on to make choices about putting off a number of things in their life to pursue an academic career, and a career in an area that they wanted to pursue. And we're seeing the success of that, because that becomes the modelling of for a son and a daughter. And so it's important in the journey that we do. And according to the undergraduate applications, offers and acceptances in 2019 report, which was published on the 28th of October, a record number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were applying to study at university. Indigenous students made up over 7,000 applications, an increase of 3.3% on the previous year. Indigenous enrolments in government-funded vet programs increased from 81,915 in 2005 to 105,191 in 2015. So we're seeing a greater increase in take-up within the TAFE sector. There's been steady, positive improvement in the promotion of Indigenous students in the proportion, of Indigenous students enrolling in higher education vet qualifications, so Cert 3 and above, increasing from 38.3% in 2005 to 54% in 2015. We know that our students who undertake vet in rural, regional and remote locations are participating at the same rate as other vet students from the same locations. Let's also look at how we're defining success in Indigenous education. It needn't be viewed through the same lens as non-Indigenous Australia. Our paths may look different, but if they're working towards a life of employment and self-sustainability, then they should be encouraged and celebrated, and where possible, given the opportunity to merge. There is an old adage when I trained as a teacher, was to teach from the known to the unknown and understand the culture of a child to enable a better outcome. While everyone understands and learns differently in the way they access knowledge, we have an obligation to build on the knowledge of their prior learning. That is, parents as early educators who influence and shape a child's early life. Future policy successes must be framed in terms of realising an individual's potential rather than just teaching on par with the average Australian outcomes. While keeping an eye on the quality of educational alternatives, we need to ensure that our children's outcomes improve at all stages of education, and we must foster a culture of excellence and high expectation aspirations, not the concept of low expectation and of lower levels of attainment. I also want to use tonight as an opportunity for all of us to explore the role of Indigenous history in education as it plays in informing the direction of our nation. Education is critical to improving Indigenous Australian life outcomes and is essential that our children feel comfortable and supported in their school environments. Let's talk about what it means to be comfortable. For our students, learning their own language is crucial to develop a sense of identity and fostering a sense of belonging. As English is for Australians, or the mother tongue of culturally and linguistically diverse populations, we celebrate those. But I often hear the reverse for Indigenous students with their languages. I want to share with you the comments and reflections of a group of youth in the Kimberley Suicide Roundtable forum that I have. A couple of points, and this was repeated to me in Alice Springs by a young Aboriginal man. They talked about how can we define ourselves when everybody views us as a deficit? How can we view ourselves if we are not encouraged to reach beyond the capability of the other children in a classroom? And one young fellow in particular said, "You do it well in sport. If we're a good sports person, we are supported to the hilt. We are encouraged to reach our peak." And we see that manifested time and time again. But the most damning comment was from the young fellow in Alice Springs who said to me, "I want our adults to tell us they love us." He said, "I get criticised." He said, "What I long for is an adult to say, 'I love you.'" And that left me dumbfounded in terms of saying to him, "You must have been told that." And he said, "No, not that I can remember." He said, "But if in death I hear the beautiful words that are spoken to somebody as we bury them, but we never tell them in life." He said, "We have to change that if we need to reach the pinnacles of success." And so there is some reflection that we need to do in the education process. This year marks the United Nations Year of Indigenous Languages, and throughout 2019 the Morrison government has supported a range of activities that have helped highlight the important role of Indigenous languages and how it plays within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and communities. Language is what defines us. It's more than just a means of communications. It is what makes a culture unique, and it defines our identity. More than 250 Indigenous Australian languages were spoken on our continent at the time of European settlement in 1788. Today, only 13 traditional languages are still acquired by children, while another 100 or so are spoken to various degrees by older generations. The reality is that these languages are at risk as elders pass away. So I ask, what makes these languages any different to those taught in our nation's classrooms? As we preference French, Italian, Cantonese, Japanese or Spanish, why don't we incorporate the rich Indigenous languages we have here in Australia, where schools and communities choose to do so? We aren't seeing a greater teaching of Indigenous languages in our schools, where Aboriginal children speak one or more Aboriginal languages fluently. I've taught children in my classes who retain their principal language, but work to become as equally fluent in English. Why don't we explore and better understand the Indigenous culture through language? As a nation, we need to acknowledge the role Indigenous language can play in defining Indigenous Australia. And it should never be seen as an impediment because it devalues an important element of a child's worth, as opposed to being a strength to build from. And importantly, the role it can play in better supporting Indigenous students, improving their place and comfortability in the mainstream education system. For all students, learning Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander languages provides a distinctive means of understanding the country in which they live, including relationships between land, the environment and people. The ongoing and necessary reacclimation and revitalisation of these languages also contributes to reconciliation. Language is just not a fundamental element of culture and identity, but it is something that we should be valued and embraced to support our children and our innovation in a modern economic market. Language is just the beginning of this conversation. We need to challenge how our institutions have defined Indigenous Australia and the role our culture can play in educating Australians. Truth-telling plays an important part in this role. Australia has rich histories, all areas of equal importance in defining who we are as a modern nation. I want us all to have and encourage conversations, because through conversation we'll become more comfortable with each other about our shared past, our present and our future aspirations. Let me say that truth-telling is not a contest of histories. It's not us versus them, which has too often been used to frame these debates in an educational context. Truth-telling is an acceptance that there can be shared stories around events in our nation's history. People can form views, hold different perspectives, and that is their right. Excuse me, but there's also their responsibility to acknowledge these different perspectives and respect the views of others. It is the acknowledgement that we have a past that can at times be challenging. It's also an acknowledgement that as a nation, we don't let these histories define us in a negative sense, nor limit what we can achieve going forward. It's acknowledging our pre-colonial history, the massacres and displacement from land, the government policies that, no matter how well-meaning, has caused disadvantage across the country, the loss of culture for Indigenous Australians. It's not about assigning guilt or blame. It's about understanding our collective and shared history. And history has many levels. However, there are common threads, and that'll always prevail. Comfortability for Indigenous Australians won't be achieved through apportioning guilt or blame, but through acknowledgement and understanding from all. It's about rising above the differences or our past and building upon the many great things that define us as a nation of people. When we discuss Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia, I say with complete certainty we have more in common and more to celebrate than not. And for young Indigenous Australians, how we explore our truth and provide the environment to foster comfortability in who they are will be crucial to continuing to narrow the gap and ensure that our nation is blessed with the same opportunity and potential. This is why I'm committed to delivering constitutional recognition in Indigenous Australian in this term of Parliament. It is an acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's place in Australia. Recognition of the world's oldest and longest continuous culture on our nation's birth certificate is an important step. Constitutional recognition is important for the reason we have discussed tonight. It is an acknowledgement that it is long overdue and one that will give hope and comfort to future generations. It's interesting to consider why we as a nation have struggled with the concept of constitutional recognition. And if I'm brutally honest, prior to 1967, we held a special place. We held a privileged position in the Constitution. And I can't remember reading anywhere voices of protest, but rather a deafening silence to the acceptance of our position as a race. The first 15 years of my life precluded me from being counted as an Australian by reason of Section 127 of the Australian Constitution until it was repealed in 1967. What do we want the future of Indigenous education to look like? So how do we build respect and understanding and improve comfortability alongside truth-telling? Through genuine partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and communities, and through more effective collaboration between education providers, agencies and professions. That is our challenge. So let's look again at what's working. Let's listen to the voices of those unheard Indigenous Australians who are working to improve school attendance, teach Indigenous history and sustain our culture. The Australian curriculum includes the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures cross-curriculum priority. This is an important avenue for providing all Australian students the opportunity to learn about the depth, wealth and diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. However, anecdotal feedback suggests the implementation of the cross-curriculum priority is mixed. Barriers to effective implementation include limited cultural competencies among some of our teachers, poor partnerships between schools and local Indigenous communities, and an imbalance between Indigenous contents and the implementation of core curriculum requirements such as English and maths. We readily focus attention on the curriculum, on climate and climate change, but not on our shared history. There is more to be done to ensure teachers are appropriately supported to embed Indigenous Australians' perspectives into their classroom practice, with a focus on improving the primary and secondary schooling experience of our students. Our children will shape the future of this country, and it is critical that all students have a fuller understanding of Australia's history that appropriately includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. Engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and communities cannot be localised to a small number of schools. It is important that all schools across our country work to develop the capacity to engage with their local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community to ensure local cultural context is understood in classrooms, and that all students have the opportunity to learn about the rich and diverse histories and the cultures that make up their school. This includes help to build a sense of identity and to foster a sense of belonging. As a nation that is as diverse in ethnicity, and for those who have built our country to what we know it today, we have acknowledged that difference in the way that we've worked. So let's bring Indigenous Australia into our everyday discourse. Let's break down those barriers locally and organically. It must be authentic and genuine, which is why I'm not going to stand here tonight and tell you how to do it. I ask that you go out and work alongside and in partnership with local community to ensure the acceptance and showcasing of culture through an educational frame, and make sure that it is done respectfully and appropriately. Comfortability is a two-way street. We cannot lose sight of that. And it is only achieved through walking and working together in partnership and at a pace that is accepted by all involved. I'd like to pay particular credit to my colleague, the Honourable Dan Tehan, Minister for Education, for his commitment to supporting Indigenous students within the education system. And I enjoy the ongoing discussions with him about some of the thinking that we need to take forward into the future. Tonight I've spoken about the role education can play in continuing to close the gap, to empower communities and provide greater opportunities for future Australians. These are all important things I want you to think about in the coming days and coming months. How you can, through your work, continue to advance these important causes. But I also want all of us to think about this. We often speak about the big picture of Indigenous Australians, the need for an Indigenous voice, the need for constitutional recognition, and the need to close the gap. More importantly, how do we celebrate success and acknowledge achievement? But what does it look like to a young Indigenous Australian? What does it look like to a child in a community who is at risk of becoming another statistic? What can we do to give greater hope to that child? To help them overcome the barriers of deficit and low expectation in relation to education and the broader matters that they will face in life? To help give them the education that will set them on a path to realise employment, to realise empowerment, and to realise a better future for the next generation. As we do for every Australian child, we need the same journey, the same curriculum, and the same expectations. Tonight we've discussed where we're headed. The future looks more promising than the past, but we must collectively accept responsibility and resolve to continue this work to pave the path to a brighter future. We all start with a blank canvas, as the Rainbow Serpent tells. From this was born the most remarkable nation on the planet, full of rich and diverse history. Its people empowered by potential and opportunity. This is how we must view every child as they embark on their educational journey. Let's not limit potential because of origin or geography. Let's resolve to shape their paths as our nation was shaped, so that their lives are rich, full and rewarding. That is our challenge. That is our opportunity. That gives us a moment to reflect on what is the best possible pathway that we can give an Indigenous child at every tier of education, to enable them to be the best they can. And at some point, I want to see in the future, Australia celebrate a young Indigenous student who succeeds, meets all the criteria of a Rhodes Scholar, but ultimately becomes the Prime Minister of this nation. Thank you.